Okay, welcome back, everybody. Our third speaker today is Beth Patton from Syracuse University, I guess a colleague of Daniel's, where she's an assistant professor. And I guess among other things, it's exciting news. She was just recently awarded a career award from the NSF, which is really, I think, a demonstration of great promise and very interesting work that she's doing. Just kind of reading over her biography, I was struck by this term epistemicide, which I think as scientists, as you know, kind of progressives, any word with "side" in it, I think, kind of makes us nervous. And to sort of see that we, as the gatekeepers at some level of knowledge, if we're really, you know, kind of, that's what the role of science of science is, of library science, that you can actually play a kind of role with that weight is kind of you know, kind of sobering, I guess. So I'm very excited to learn more about your work. The title of today's talk is Epistemicide and Epistemic Injustices in the Information Field.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. I do think, you know, there is some, you know, power, I think, behind the term. And I think that's part of, you know, one of the reasons ultimately why we decided to go with this term instead of some other things. So first, I'd like to say thanks to Daniel Acuna and everybody who's been putting this program together, and all of my scholars in the field that have been doing this work, focusing on communities of color, thinking about marginalized communities and what that means for us in information science. A special thanks to my colleagues and comrades at the iSchool, and especially in my research group LIT, and to my co-authors Melinda Sebastian, Jun Yon, Danielle Bertolini, and Alexandra Grimm. So Stephen started us off with some of my big questions at the very beginning, kind of nicely. As information professionals, we talk and think a lot about how do we support people's capacity to know? How do we help organize information better? How do we create systems where they can access things faster and the things that they need to know? But we also need to be thinking about how do we harm people's capacity to know? And I think even to take that a little bit further, I'd like us to think, whom do we support and whom do we harm? So the outline for my talk today is to introduce the concepts of epistemicide and epistemic injustices, give you a few examples of the different types of the epistemic injustices. I want to describe the types of harms that happen because of these injustices, why this is specifically important for us in information science and academia. And then I want to talk about some justice-oriented solutions to leave us with a positive note of some things, what we can do. So most of us here probably know that epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge and the way that we know things. And so if epistemology is how we know things, what we know, then epistemicide is the killing of what we know. We define epistemicide as the killing, silencing, annihilation, or devaluation of a knowledge system. And this can happen, like I like to say, by pen, by sword, by fire, right? There's lots of ways in which we can go about harming people's ways of knowing. And this term is coming out of liberatory justice practices, Epistemologies of the South by D'Souza, and his newer books, Knowledge Born in the Struggle. So we all know some historical examples of epistemicide. We can think about the transatlantic slave trade and what Africans lost in that slave trade, their religions, their languages, their names, their familial experiences, the science that they knew from engaging with their indigenous lands, how to use plants, animals, that type of thing. We can look back to the 1500s and think about the Salem witch trials and how women were put on trial for women's ways of knowing. We've seen really recently the horrible tragedies unfolding in Canada, and I'm sure as the United States starts to investigate our Indian boarding schools here too, what it meant to have a program that would kill the Indian and save the man. The whole idea was to remove indigenous cultures from these communities and make them more assimilated to Canadian or US values. That exact idea is an epistemicide of their ways of knowing. We can look at Nazi book burnings and destroying different literature about the LGBTQ community and what that means when we destroy a whole branch of science and literature, and all of a sudden that's not available for the next generation. And we can even look more recently on the US borders and look at what are US policies in terms of separating children from the family separation policies and what that might mean in terms of affecting the next generation's epistemologies. So I think very much about epistemicide as the suppression of someone's epistemic agency. And so in those examples, those were, very dramatic, very large ways that we have hurt people's ways of knowing. But it doesn't have to be that extreme. We can do this in everyday ways in our schools, in our classrooms, in our libraries, and through the computer systems that we build. And so it's time for us to take a step back and think about, are these things that we are building elevating certain privileged perspectives of knowledge, and is it holding back other ways of knowing? Epistemic injustice comes from Miranda Fricker's work, and she defines epistemic injustice as the wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. Fricker identified two types of epistemic injustices: testimonial and hermeneutical. And my group in our paper, we identified two more: participatory and curricular. So I'll go through and define each of those and give us an example. I'll say this first. I think epistemicide happens when all of these injustices occur collectively and reflect this structured and systemic oppression of ways of knowing, right? We can all experience little individual injustices, but it's this kind of entire system of injustices we bump against that really is the epistemicide, when all of these things are happening at once and continuing to happen. So I see very much these injustices happening within a field leading to epistemicide. So first, testimonial injustice is when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. The example Fricker gives in her book is in To Kill a Mockingbird, and how the jury doesn't believe Tom Robinson's testimony, even though he is truthful and honest. They are bigoted against him, and therefore they dismiss his experience, right? His testimony of what happened is not credible enough for them to believe. This is a comic which I think really handles this kind of idea well. If you've been a woman in a room full of men talking about, I don't know, computer science or something, you have an idea, you share it, people don't hear your idea, someone else comes along and repeats it, and all of a sudden now it's a great idea. It's not that there was a problem with the idea in and of itself. The problem was the amount of credibility we gave the person who shared it. Right? So the injustice comes with not giving enough credibility to the person that's testifying. We've seen this really recently when women of color speak out about mental health issues and the kinds of criticism that they get. And of course, we can even think to the Olympics last week with Simone Biles and the kinds of things that folks have said about her when she was trying to take care of her mental health. The uncomfortable truth is that when racially minoritized women speak out about their mental health, they are less likely to be believed than their non-racialized counterparts. That is the testimonial injustice. We can look to COVID care more recently and understand that doctors were giving a lower rate of credibility to Black people's testimony about their own health. So Black people were going to the hospital and saying, I can't breathe. The doctors were saying, hey, your oxygen meter is saying you're breathing at this level. And they were deciding what levels of care to give. They were sending people home, and people were going home and dying. But since 2007, we've known that darker skin makes pulse oximeters read at a lower oxygen level. And yet, this is the medical equipment that we're creating. It's what we're using in these testing protocols. And we're elevating what this test says over the testimony of Black people when they're in the hospital and saying they can't breathe, right? So here is a point where we see this testimonial injustice actually affect people's lives and the medical care that they're given, and their ability to interact with the kinds of tools that we create. So I rolled through that kind of quickly, but here's just another slide, I guess. These devices give errors for patients with darker treatment. And so we need to know that as a field who builds medical information technology, but it also means that when people share their experiences with us, we need to believe them. Hermeneutical injustice is a gap in our collective resources for making sense of our social experiences. Fricker gives the example of Condoleezza Rice testifying about sexual harassment. Before we had the terminology to talk about sexual harassment at work, many women understood what that experience was, but didn't necessarily have a language to talk about what was happening. Or laws to prosecute what was happening. And again, when the Me Too movement happened, we saw an increase in people reporting sexual harassment and sexual assaults across the entire world. Participatory injustice is the exclusion of one's participation in their own epistemological development. And this includes, completely keeping people out of education, or just keeping someone out of the loop. This is a picture of my grandfather. He wanted to be a doctor in the state of Alabama in the 1940s. There was no place where a Black man could get a medical degree. So he had to go to Tennessee in order to get his medical degree and to learn how to practice medicine. More recently, the University of Austin's computer science program had been using a algorithm to decide who gets into their program and who doesn't. And what this was doing was like unfairly dismissing folks who were from schools that were getting ranked certain ways, and people weren't reading recommendation letters and other things like that. So we see this kind of who got dismissed based on how this algorithm was set. Curricular injustice happens when physical resources are not available to help support epistemic growth and are used to suppress and eliminate the creation of rival and alternative knowledges. Recently, when I was writing a paper, I talked about different Black theorists, and the feedback that I got was, nobody knows who this is. You have to make sure you explain the context and why you're citing them. And I don't think when I've ever cited German theorists or other theorists nobody's ever asked me to explain who Habermas was to them. And it's not because these other folks, these people were also brilliant critical theorists. We should all know who these writers are. And so what does it mean when these perspectives are missing? Carter G. Woodson told us almost 100 years ago that we were missing the Black experience from our educational departments. And 100 years later, we still have this problem where we only talk about the Black community, in accordance to civil rights or in accordance to slavery, and very other little things are discussed in our US educational systems. And if we look back through textbooks, we see that there has been this focus on this white ideal for what our American history has been. So what kind of harm does this do? I've talked about these different examples of epistemic injustice, and I think us thinking about the harm is something really, really important. This primary harm, it happens to the individual. I share my experience and it's dismissed. The secondary harm happens to the collective. I share my experience in a room of colleagues. I get dismissed. My colleagues are also affected because now all of a sudden I don't want to speak up at meetings, right? So my immediate community is affected by that. But what happens when people have been historically excluded from academia? And we know, the last talk was about citations. If academia is like really built, standing on the shoulders of giants and building on that work that's come before us, if those perspectives are missing from our educational systems, how do we build upon that? That harm kind of becomes hard to imagine and impossible to calculate. And so I really think about it very much as like a ripple effect. That harm continues to grow. And once those things have been dismissed in the beginning, there's really no pulling back from it once it gets into those next generations. We can't go back and find the work that we've already missed. I'm going to go through this a bit because I talked through that. So why is this important for us in information science and academia? Well, mostly because we've tasked ourselves with not only managing our own knowledge and helping, making that knowledge accessible, but also all of the other knowledge from all of the other fields, right? If we are building databases to find all of the information for folks in schools or for chemists or in law departments, that means we are responsible for deciding what information is important, what information should be kept, and if folks will be able to find it in the future. We see examples across universities where professors aren't believed that they are professors on their campuses, which creates this experience of not belonging. It allows them to not be themselves, not pursue areas of study that they would want to study. We see students of color outnumbering our professors, and students having struggles with finding professors who can support critical areas of work that they want to go into because our professoriate doesn't have the experience with some of these other ways of knowing. I think very much about epistemicide as a hermeneutical experience. I went to hear a colleague's presentation and folks were criticizing the talk, but the methods that she used were correct. They were just out of the bounds of what we understood collectively to be correct. And if I hadn't have been in the room to say, hey, she did that right, that scholarship would have gotten dismissed again. And so what does that look like if we don't have these folks in the room to stand up and say, this is an appropriate way for us to build knowledge within our communities? I think a lot about participatory justice and access. What does it mean for me to get tenure that I have to publish in a top tier research journal, but then the folks that I'm writing for, librarians, don't always have access to these types of journals? How does that play into equity issues in terms of people accessing my work? How am I going to write about equity but then charge this money for this article? And I think, if we get into citations, publication counts, journal impact factor, and looking at journals who have traditionally dismissed works of color, critical race theory, works from other minoritized communities, if it's not cited there, it doesn't belong there, and that work has a harder time making it into those spaces. And if we as journal reviewers aren't familiar with a wide category of theorists and methods, then that means we also run the risk of turning away work that is valid because it's outside of our frames of reference. Recently, the Department of Archives and History in the state of Alabama said that they had intentionally collected Confederate history while intentionally not collecting Black history. And so if you go to their digital archive, there are no articles about my dad, who was the first Black person in Alabama to desegregate schools. They have intentionally tarnished what resources our community can use to understand our state history. That's a real problem. If we look to Virginia, their state library has archived every gubernatorial paper before Governor Wild and all of the governors, except for the last two, after Governor Wild. If you're a child in Virginia and you want to do a report on Black governors, there was only one and his papers haven't been digitized. So we are building these archives and these collections that are missing these entire perspectives, through our own decisions as information scientists and professionals. So how do we move towards justice? The first thing I think is by providing platforms for folks of color, marginalized communities who are sharing their experiences. And I think this also means, believing your colleagues when they tell you their experiences. It means don't kind of try to make it all right. Don't try to belittle it. When folks speak up in meetings, support them in meetings. It can be meaningful to bump into somebody in the hallway later and say, oh, I totally agreed with what you said, but it's much more powerful to demonstrate that support in that moment. So think about how you can support and amplify what your colleagues are saying. Believe your community members when they tell you something. Work towards amplifying and recentering voices in the community. One thing I think that's really important for us to think about is acknowledge when your own experience or your own knowledge about something is limited and someone else's experience or knowledge may deserve more credibility. Really think about that. We're all academics, we're all professionals. There are lots of things that we know, but there are even more things that we don't know. And so have that moment when you can take a step back and know that you maybe are not an expert on a particular topic. Moving towards hermeneutical injustice. So one experience that I see across our US cataloging systems is Indigenous perspectives missing from catalogs. So one solution is to create a thesaurus that supports Indigenous communities' epistemic powers. And so the Mashantucket Pequot Thesaurus of American Indian Terminology is incorporated so that we can use Indigenous perspectives and have them included into mainstream controlled vocabularies. We want to make sure that concepts and theories around race, gender, and oppression are understood by all of us in the information science field so that this work is not just being left to our colleagues who focus on this work, and that these ideas are more generally stood by more of us in our field. Citational justice has been talked a lot about. Very recently at HCI and some other conferences, thinking about how do we cite through a justice lens. One of the things I think publishing in open access and making sure that your work is available to community members that need it. Think about how journal impact might contribute to a participatory injustice. I think this is something as folks are going up for tenure and for their third-year reviews, thinking about how this practice might impact scholars who are focusing on research involving their communities. Think about the high cost of making journal articles accessible. I think we need to rethink how we count impact of community service and work in terms of, and especially in terms of asking BIPOC faculty, women of color to do more service around areas of diversity and inclusion. Think about how we're weighting and counting that work. And finally, looking at projects like grassroots projects like Rocket City Civil Rights that is looking to preserve and make available histories of local communities that have been overlooked by mainstream archives. A couple of suggested readings I have for y'all: Presumed Incompetent, On Being Included, White Logic, White Methods. All help build a more robust idea. And of course, Decolonizing Methodology, if you haven't interacted with that book before. There's a couple of journal articles or journal issues that are all about this topic. The Jealous issue of July 2019 and the International Journal of Information, Diversity, and Inclusion also focuses on this. So what's next for my work? I think that there's probably some more epistemic injustices out there, and thinking about where these are playing out in other places that I haven't thought about. Thinking more specifically about how epistemicide intersects with tenure and promotion, and then trying to validate this conceptual framework that I came up with through more qualitative and quantitative work. So that's my ideas about epistemicide, my references. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take questions. And of course, I'll be on the panel a bit later.
All right, thank you, Beth, for a very thought-provoking presentation, and we'll give people a chance to come up with questions. So if we're waiting for other people to come up with questions.
Sylvia has a question, sorry, she cannot raise her hand.
Once again, I'm missing.
No, I'm a proxy for her. She's sending me a private message.
Okay.
Sorry for that. I can't raise my hand for some reason. I'm hearing myself. Yeah, well, thank you so much for your talk. Very provoking. And I was just wondering, would you consider also I can't say the word epistemicide, okay, when, like algorithmic epistemicide, so to say. And if you know any work on that, I would love to know, because there's this recent paper talking about how Google Scholar does not account for the citations in Spanish papers. So if you write in Spanish and your community of readers is in Spanish, those citations won't be taken into account. So, and also for citation extraction, language and discipline is a huge problem, right? If you write in the humanities, your citations won't get extracted. So do you think this could be seen in the frame, because this word is so new to me, of epistemicide? And if you know of any other works, I would love to know. Thank you.
That's a really great question. I do absolutely think that that's related. And you mentioned language, and you mentioned, areas, so different areas being more findable in Google Scholar. And that's also true depending on the type of scholarship you're doing, right? It does journal articles really well. It does book chapters not as well, right? So like just kind of knowing if you're the kind of field that relies on book publishing, those indicators aren't going to be as strong for you. One of the things I think about is that I write stuff for people who are going to be librarians. And so, like, does it matter to me if other academics are citing my paper, or does it matter to me if like the next generations of librarians are reading it? And how do I count that as impact? And so, yeah, I think that there's lots of really interesting ways to think about it. I haven't seen, beyond the example about the grade paper, and of course Sophia Noble's work comes to mind about Google and calling out their algorithms and the biases that are there. Virginia Eubanks has a great book that looks at how, well, of course, like a librarian, I read too much to remember the exact titles of everything, but it's about how big data and kind of this machine learning helps automated inequality. Thank you. I was going to get there somewhere. I think that might have some things that are getting close. The concept of epistemicide came out in 2009, so it's really new. And I think before I used it within my conference paper last year, it hasn't really been used in the information science field largely. So I think it's probably there, but maybe under other names. And that's one of the things that I hope that this work kind of does, is bring, when we talk about injustice over here, and then we talk about injustice over here, we're really missing how these things are intersecting and reacting to each other. And so I look at this as like this kind of big umbrella for us to kind of pull these different things together. So Sylvia, I think it's out there. I think we could find plenty examples of what that looks like. I don't know who else is doing it besides those couple of folks, and they're not calling it that.
Other questions? So one as someone who does some editing for journals, and I won't name the publisher. It's not an open access publisher, but so one thing, we get this little window that pops up that says, please consider diversity when you're selecting reviewers and evaluating papers, but it's extremely soft. It's not. It's sort of a nice little thing to be reminded of. But what I am realizing is that having tools that could help identify things like citation bias. And again, I don't know how, it seems like what you really need to do is have these automated systems to identify race and gender and be able to analyze the citations. What I'm realizing is that if that information were available to an editor, that actually can be a very valuable place to kind of catch some of these issues that you're raising. And I don't know if that's something that's kind of, maybe it's a little bit far off in the distance, just sort of given where the technology is now, but I'm also appreciating that that's another kind of stage of gatekeeping where a lot can be done to hurt, but potentially a lot could be done to help. And I just don't know, is that anywhere in the discussion?
Yeah. So I've been thinking a lot, because I'm a librarian and I teach librarians, right? So I think a lot about it in the book reviews that come out. And so there's this book called Skippy John Jones, and I don't know if y'all know what it is. It's a kid's book. I hate it, but it's about this Chihuahua cat. No, it's about a Siamese cat that thinks it's a Chihuahua, and it uses extremely bad stereotypes and really lazy Spanish, like where she just adds O at the end of words to make it rhyme when like the Spanish word actually rhymed. Like there's a bunch of really poor decisions in it. But if you look at the professional reviews, they're all like, this book is fun, like funner than like, whatever. It's like so fun to read. But then if you go to Amazon and you read, it's got all of these 0-star reviews, and you read it and it's like, this book is racist and I didn't give it to my kids. And so, the two extremes of like, as a librarian, you're taught to go to like book review and see what the professionals said about this book. But if our professionals aren't culturally competent, they're going to give unculturally competent reviews. And so I think that is the same thing for our journal reviewers. If we have not taught our graduate students, our master's students how to write thoughtful reviews, and I think this is where it comes into like when you don't know enough, us having enough humility to say, hey, this is outside of my area, and maybe someone with more experience in understanding these specific theorists makes more sense to review this paper. Or do the due diligence of like, looking up who Carter G. Woodson is once before giving that feedback, and making sure it's appropriate. And so I absolutely think those things are connected. Building the different systems of how do we get into these bias detection things, that's more science-y, if you will, than I am. But I think there's lots of things that could inform building that kind of system. And I think, if you look at syllabus audits that are happening now, going through and looking at your syllabus and who are you assigning for the students to read, and is that representing a bunch of countries? Is it representing different genders? Is it representing different races? Because, right, like our bookshelves and the syllabi that we're handing out, that's part of the problem.
That's great. Thanks. So let's see, any other questions? There was a little bit of activity in the chat. I don't know if anyone wanted to chime into the conversation now.
I do. I just
Okay,
wanted
great.
to say, I think this point about what gets valued is really, really, really important. And the university that I'm at has just announced proposed revisions to the tenure system, and I think they're really, really interesting because they look a lot more at the kind of, you know, community and, you know, what the sort of notion of a state-funded university is sort of like supporting, you know, the people. I don't think that it's happenstance that our chancellor is African American and at the time this is happening. And so I think that there's this, you know, and I would love to see where other systems are, you know, taking their guidelines and moving them. And these are, I mean, not yet adopted, so hopefully they'll get adopted as proposed. But you know, very holistic and looking at things like how to do more holistic teaching evaluations as well, because we know those are super biased. But you're doing really amazing work, so I'm looking forward to keeping in touch and hearing more about it.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm wondering, can I get tenure while I just write about how terrible tenure is? Like fingers crossed. You know, I think that there's like these important things in it, but it's one of the things that I always push the folks around me to think about is like, if we want to build more inclusive spaces, right, then we have to be willing to change the space that we're building. We can't invite folks in and then expect them to behave just like we do. And so if we truly value folks that believe in other things, that means that we need to like step back and reevaluate our value systems that are going to be more reflective of what we all think about now. And so it's one of those traps that, you know, like, I want to pull in, you know, people of color to my institution all the time, but then like also I want us to be a better institution first. And so, you know, how do we do those things? And it's structuration, right? Like pulling folks in and allowing them to change the structure that we've built and making space for that. And so it gives me hope that other folks are starting to think about, you know, how do we more holistically think about the impact that we're having as scholars.